I don't have a funny intro this time, so let's just start the video. Let's start right at the beginning. What is snapshotting? Snapshotting is a property of certain long-lasting abilities in Genshin. What it means when an ability snapshots is that it will take the stats of the character who created it at its moment of creation and continue to exist and do its thing using those snapshotted stats, whether that be buffing or damaging or healing. Every time that entity does something, it will refer back to its snapshotted stats instead of the character's current stats. The example that most of you are probably familiar with is Xiangling's Pyronado. It snapshots her stats upon casting, so if you cast it in Bennett burst, it will continue to deal damage using the attack buff that Bennett gives. My attack is 30-35. I cast my burst. It's dealing 17-190, and then I swap off field. I've lost my Bennett buff. I'm down to 2000 attack, but come on. I'm still doing the same damage. But that interaction is kind of what most people know snapshotting as. Just stand in your Bennett circle before casting Xiangling burst. But there's a lot more to it. There are a lot of little details to know about this mechanic that all kind of subtly change the way you play characters that snapshot. So let's start unraveling this with looking at how stats snapshot. While this isn't a hard and fast rule, the general thing you can keep in mind is if it shows up on this stat screen, it can be snapshotted. If it doesn't, it can't. There are a few stats that this covers, but the one that you'll encounter the most is non-elemental damage percent. And I don't mean physical damage percent because that shows up. I mean things like Aqua Simulacra, this type of damage bonus, the one that doesn't come from your goblet. Aqua gives a 20% damage bonus whenever enemies are nearby, and this damage bonus can't be snapshotted. The same goes for artifacts, and Fischl actually makes this remarkably easy to show off. Her best set, Golden Troop, gives elemental skill damage bonus, and the 4-piece set boosts her skill damage even further when she's off field. This portion of Oz's damage, his attack damage, is snapshotted once he's created. So I've been on field for more than 2 seconds, and I've lost my Golden Troop buff. I cast Oz, he's snapshotted. He's dealing 8985, and I go off field, and he starts doing over 10,000 damage. Even though Oz can snapshot Fischl's attack and crit stats, he can't snapshot the damage percent given by her artifact set, and his damage will dynamically change to reflect that. Now, there are a few exceptions to this rule. There are some pieces of gear that allow you to snapshot the generic damage percent stats that they give. Luckily, I have them all, so let's look at them. For the weapons, we have Song of Stillness, Serpent Spine, the Primordial Jadewing Spear, the Alley Flash, and the Iron Sting. All these weapons give some sort of conditional generic damage percent buff, and for some reason, unlike the other weapons, these can snapshot. The same goes for, let's see if I even have, oh great, I do have enough pieces. The damage percent given by 4-piece Harmonic Whimsy and by 4-piece Unfinished Reverie. These also can both snapshot. However, most of the time with weapons, it doesn't really matter that they can't be snapshotted. It's somewhat important on the exceptions that I mentioned because all of those have conditional buffs where you need to do something to get a buff that only lasts for a certain duration. But most of the time, it's things like Aqua, where as long as you're near the enemy, you'll get 20% damage, which is always if you're dealing damage, or like Slingshot, where you have to be hitting an enemy with a normal or charged attack to get the boost, so there's no way to make use of this off field unless a character comes out that does normal and charged attack damage off field. That's gonna happen and I'm gonna look stupid. Or like Stringless, this buff can't be snapshotted, but it's permanently active, so it doesn't matter. Let's go over some examples that do matter. Characters that buff damage percent in their kit, their damage percent can't be snapshotted. Of course, the main example being Farina. Okay, let's get off the weapon tab here. In Farina's case, not being able to snapshot is usually a good thing, because if you, say, cast Pyronado before she gets her maximum buff, before she builds all her fanfare stacks, its damage will continue to update as Farina gets more fanfare and buffs more damage percent. So you don't have to do all your fanfare building before summoning Pyronado or casting Oz. You can do it early in the rotation and they'll still get the full buff. With something like Yelan, it's a bit more of a downside. She gives a buff that slowly gets larger and larger to your on-fielder and only your on-fielder. Because it's not snapshottable, you can't do things like you would with Bennett Burst, where you use units that snapshot within it and effectively get Bennett's buff on 2 or 3 units. This damage percent buff will only ever benefit your on-fielder. There's also Raiden. This, again, it's a bit less of an important one. As long as her skill is up, she'll give your whole party a buff that increases their burst damage based on their own burst cost. It has a way longer duration than it does a cooldown, so as long as you're constantly keeping this skill up, it's not a problem, but there are situations like if you don't refresh it and you let it expire in the middle of one of Xiangling's bursts, she will start dealing less damage as a result. The last form of damage percent buffing that can't be snapshotted is found with Shenhe. A4 passive lets her buff skill and burst damage or normal charge and plunging damage. Neither of these show up in your menu, so neither can be snapshotted. But like Raiden, this is a full party buff. It's not really likely that this will be a huge factor, but I want to be thorough. And Shenhe also leads me pretty perfectly into the next type of buff, which sort of half snapshots, which is this type, this sort of additive base damage buff. Shenhe has this, Yunjin has this, weirdly enough Farazan also has this. Shanyun does too, but I forgot about her. Here it is, damage will be increased by 32% of Farazan's base attack. It does as the name suggests, it adds a portion of your character's attack in the case of Shenhe, base attack in the case of Farazan, and defense in the case of Yunjin. And also, I think Citlali has one of these, right? Yeah, Citlali's C1 is another example. Things like this, it's less of a direct buff to your character and more like another character hijacking your on-fielder's stats and dealing damage through them. During her burst, Yunjin gives this damage increase of 61% of her defense. Whenever normal attack damage is dealt, before you calculate all the damage percent, before you calculate crit, any of that stuff, all that's happening is the raw attack percent scaling. Yunjin slides in there, she throws that 61% of her defense onto the calculation, and then you do all your other multiplications with damage percent, with crit, with if you have any reactions going on. And all of these additive base damage bonus type of buffs, all of them are calculated in real time. If Yunjin's defense changes over the course of her burst, then the amount of damage that she's adding on to your normal attacks will also change. And while the buff itself doesn't snapshot and can't be snapshotted, because of the way it works, it can be applied to abilities that do snapshot. Ayaka is a unit that snapshots. I promise this is going to be the last time I jump ahead. So if Shenhe buffs Ayaka and then Ayaka casts her burst, it will effectively be like Shenhe dealing damage with Ayaka's snapshotted stats. Now let's go on to the only simple example. This specialized specific crit damage for one elemental type never snapshots. No weird technicalities, no exceptions, none of these snapshot. On Mika and Farazan, these don't really matter because the buff is full party anyways. It's more important for Goro and Sara, as both their buffs are single target and actually don't last very long. And for the last stat that can't snapshot, EM. Kind of. EM's a weird one. It does snapshot in the case of amplifying reaction damage, those being vape and melt, but for all the other reactions, both additive and transformative, those will always calculate in real time using your character's current EM. And then of course there are things like the Cryo Resonance or like Lava Walker and Thunder Soother sets, is that what they're called? Where the stats that they give is dependent on the enemy that you're damaging and they don't show up in the stat screen, so none of those are snapshottable. Now that we've figured out how snapshotting works, let's look at what characters can even do it. Now, usually snapshotting is only really referred to in the context of damaging abilities, but there are a lot of different characters that use snapshotting in different ways. I like to break them all down into 3 different groups. First, characters that can snapshot are shielders. Every shielder, without exception, snapshots when they create their shield. For example, right here, I've just maxed out my Xiangling. He's got 60,000 HP. Stand over here, make the shield, then take all his stuff off. He's now down to his base, 14,000, but let's see his shield. Come on. Attack me, please, before it expires. It's still taking a beating. Alright. Whenever a shielder creates a shield, it will maintain its health until it's either broken or expired. Disregarding shield stacking mechanics like Kirara and Toma have, or shield healing like Lanyan C2 has, but I don't know, you're smart enough to get that. There's not really a great name for the second group, so I've kind of taken to calling them the weird ones. The way this group uses snapshotting is that they have one instance of damage that happens after some extended cast time, but that ability snapshots on its cast. For example, GeoMC, they summon this rock, and after long enough, and after long enough, and after long enough, and after long enough, it'll explode. Oh my god, I got it perfectly. And that explosion damage is snapshotted upon the rock's creation, with the idea that the initial hit and the explosion will always deal the same damage. Another unit like this is Linny. When he hits enemies with his level 2 charged attack, they will create this little hat, and those will snapshot Linny's stats upon their creation. Let's check that out here. While within Benny Burst, my hat does... Come on, let's try it. 56,000, and then my second one, I run out of Bennett Burst, my buff has expired, and the hat still does 56,000. There are other units in this category, like Layla or Wanderer, who their delay is really, really short, and honestly, in the case of Layla, I don't even know why she snapshots, but she does, so I'll mention her. When in her skill, Layla slowly creates these night stars, and their damage snapshots when they start to launch. I guess to ensure that all 4 stars deal the same damage, but she doesn't deal very good damage, so it doesn't matter that much. Wanderer is a bit more important. He snapshots in his burst. He snapshots right at the beginning of his animation, which is there to ensure that even if your buffs run out before the animation can play out, you'll still deal full damage. Some other of these sort of single instant snapshotters are D-Luke with his burst, Amber, Baron Bunny snapshots when she casts it, Ganyu's skill snapshots, Ayato's skill creates an illusion mimic thing that explodes, and that snapshots. The follow-up damage on Kirara's burst snapshots, not the initial hit, but I guess it doesn't really need to. This damage, the Grass Cat Cardamom explosion damage. Hu Tao is maybe the best known example of this type of snapshotting, where the moment her burst animation starts, her stats are snapshotted. So even if you run out of her infusion and attack buff during her burst animation, it will still deal full damage. The press version of Lisa's skill snapshots, this one I find really funny because it is a slow-moving projectile, so I guess it's realistic that your stats might change between casting it and it hitting an enemy. But they did not need to make it snapshot. And we can move on by mentioning the 2 weird outliers that I couldn't really fit into a category. Number 1, Sayu, her rolling attack, when you hold her E, snapshots whenever you start it. So if you get buffed during its duration, the damage won't change. The same is also true of Kirara and her hold skill. And the other is Ningguang. I admit, I don't fully know how this works, and I could be wrong about this. Forgive me for not being a Ningguang main. But her burst, it summons a bunch of homing gem projectiles, and it has a mechanic where if her skill is on field, it'll turn into a pillar and launch a few more jade projectiles. And again, I could be wrong about this, but I think how it works, the damage from the extra gems that you get from having her skill on field while you burst, that is snapshotted when she first casts the skill. I guess I can go test this out to be sure. I really gotta pay attention here. So I'm gonna, well, I'll let you do your thing first. Sacrifice Linny if need be. Skill, Bennett burst, and then those did 2,000 on not crit. I didn't see any crit was the crazy part.
Everybody stand back. It's nothing. Submit.
Yeah, that did 34 on non-crit. I don't know if I walked through the Jade screen on the control test. I don't think I did, but that's not enough to account for a 50% damage increase. So yeah, the extra stars that you get from having her skill on field and casting her burst, their damage is snapshotted when you cast the skill, not the burst. And to wrap up this collection of weirdos, I'd just like to take a moment to shout out Alhaitham. He's not quite having snapshots just for convenience. It is important to his damage, but it also is not the majority of his damage by any means. Depending on how many mirrors he has, his burst can exist for a pretty long time. So it makes sense that it snapshots at the beginning of the animation. And I'm kind of happy I looked at this because I can mention, even though EM snapshotting only works for the vape and melt reactions, it will work perfectly fine with EM scaling like this. So if you lose EM over the course of his burst, he won't start dealing less talent damage, but he will start dealing less reaction damage. Okay, on to the snapshotting that actually matters, the type that everybody knows about, where there's an ability that is lasting a long time off field and is either doing damage or healing, and that damage or healing is snapshotted at the beginning. They've kind of stopped doing this because they realized how much of a mistake it was, so this section is just going to be a comprehensive list. Xiangling is the most well-known example, but nearly everybody in 1.0 snapshotted. We went over Amber's skill, but her burst also snapshots. Same for Kaya and Lisa. And for the non-starter characters, we have Beto and Sucrose. All of these characters burst snapshot the moment they're casted. Sucrose is arguably the least important because she's not dealing a lot of talent damage. She usually uses her burst to trigger a lot of swirls. And as mentioned, all transformative reactions are calculated dynamically and unaffected by snapshotting. And of course, there's Fischl, who snapshots Oz whenever he's created. Jean's burst snapshots, but it's only the damage. This is actually kind of a theme we're gonna see. Enemies take damage when entering or exiting her field, and this is the portion of the ability that is affected by snapshotting. Chi-Chi's skill also snapshots, but it gets both damage and healing snapshotted. Mona's skill lasts a fairly long time and has a decent multiplier at the end. This snapshots on its creation. Again, Venti's burst snapshots, but it's a pretty similar situation to Sucrose, doesn't matter. Diona, again, like Jean, her healing does not snapshot, but her damage does on her burst, although it's not like she was doing much damage to begin with. Same with Xiangling. The damage done by his pillars pulsing, that's snapshotted. The same goes for Albedo's skill. He does a lot more damage than Xiangling, but I guess still not a lot. It's more important to him, is what I'm trying to say. Ganyu's burst snapshots, as does Ayato, so they actually both have two different types of snapshotting in their kit. Not really different, different in my eyes. I don't want to keep saying snapshot, so let's just run through these quickly. Rosaria's burst does, Kazuha's burst does, but like Venti and Sucrose, doesn't matter all too much. Ayaka's burst, Sayu's burst, both the damage and the healing. Same with Kokomi's skill. When it is summoned or refreshed, it snapshots both the damage and the healing. As mentioned, Ayato's burst, Kuki's burst as well. Again, the damage from Dori's burst, but not the energy recharge or healing properties. This is where we see a really sharp fall off because the next more traditional example of snapshotting, I think, is Dea. Oh no, Yao Yao does, I forgot. Her healing doesn't snapshot, but whenever she creates a Uogui through either her skill or her burst, her attack stats will be snapshotted for that Uogui's whole duration. If you noticed, they kind of stopped giving more traditional types of snapshotting to characters that deal real damage around this time. And in fact, the only characters that do a lot of damage and get most of their damage from an ability that snapshots are 1.0 characters. For everyone else, snapshotting is a relatively minor part of their kit. I say this right before Dea. Dea's skill also snapshots, and it actually can deal meaningful damage with constellations. I actually think Dea kind of signifies the death of snapshotting being an important thing to consider for your damage. Because after Dea, the only units we got that snapshot is aforementioned Kirara, the follow-up damage on her burst snapshots. And after her, all we got was Charlotte, her burst damage and healing snapshot, I guess appropriate for the photographer, and Hydro MC. I skipped over them because they're not on the character archive screen, but Animo, Electro, Dendro, and Hydro MC's bursts all snapshot on cast. But out of all of those, Dendro MC is the only one that really matters. He's the only guy that's dealing significant talent damage. And while we all know Pyronado snapshots, did you guys know that the better half of Xiangling also snapshots? There you go. There are all the abilities of snapshot. So yeah, I guess that's it. I hope you know how snapshotting works. Bye-bye.